Your Highnesses, Excellencies, dear friends of the Weicker Foundation, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start by expressing a warm welcome to all of you for joining this year's conference of the Weicker Foundation, co-organized with the Luxembourg Income Study. At the outset, I am especially grateful to welcome Your Highnesses and the representatives from government, the Parliament, the Council of State, the European institutions, and the diplomatic corps. It's a huge honor and privilege for me to introduce this conference held by a world-famous author, lecturer, thinker, Nobel Prize laureate Professor Paul Krugman. The day after a new G20 meeting, and in the limelight of still open discussions about new world organization on international trade and finance, it appears to me that we are starting or going on in a very stimulating period and starting a very exciting evening. Professor, welcome to Luxembourg. Welcome to this event, and thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. Tonight, this is not about the Weicker Foundation, so I'm not going to talk about it. You found a brochure on your seats. I just want to draw your attention on the banking account number on it. This is the very small economies. Indeed, we are financing our activities by gifts that we always deeply welcome. And in this file, I just want to express my deep gratitude to our main sponsor, the bank BGL BNP Paribas, and I also want to thank ArcelorMittal for the layout of its wonderful premises. I already hand over to Janet Gornick, Director of the Luxembourg Income Study, who will introduce the conference. To all of you, I wish an enjoyable evening, and I invite you to stay at the reception following the conference. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Good evening. It's a tremendous pleasure and an honor to welcome Paul Krugman to Luxembourg and to introduce him to this very distinguished audience. Before I turn to Professor Krugman, I'd like to say a few words about the Luxembourg Income Study. I'd also like to acknowledge some institutions here in Luxembourg that have supported this evening's event, as well as an associated research conference on inequality that the Luxembourg Income Study is hosting starting tomorrow at the University of Luxembourg. What is it that we do? The Luxembourg Income Study, which is known as LIS, is a cross-national data archive and research institute located here in Luxembourg. LIS was founded as a small project in 1983 by a group of American and European social scientists. Here in Luxembourg, the late Gaston Chabert oversaw the founding of LIS, and he guided and supported LIS for many years. During the last 27 years, LIS has grown substantially. We now have a staff of 7 here in Luxembourg and 3 who are located abroad. All 10 of us are here this evening, and I encourage you to seek us out during the reception if you might like to learn more about LIS. You should recognize the LIS staff because they're wearing name tags with the Luxembourg Income Study and our logo, which is a castle that I hope you'll recognize. Our main work at LIS entails gathering data sets based on household surveys from many countries at multiple points in time, and harmonizing them into a common format so that the data can be used for comparative research. Since LIS was founded, about 2,400 international researchers have used our data for social science and policy research, primarily on income inequality, poverty, and labor market disparities. LIS now has over 200 data sets from nearly 40 countries, and we continue to grow. Each summer, we hold a week-long workshop here in Luxembourg, which introduces young scholars to our resources. Our 2010 workshop is being held this week, and our 29 international workshop students are in the audience this evening. Tomorrow and Wednesday, LIS will host an international conference on inequality. 16 new research papers will be presented, and tomorrow evening we will be treated to a second keynote address given by Professor Tony Atkinson. All of those presenters and Professor Atkinson are also with us this evening. Let me mention that we still have some available seats at the conference venue, so if any of you are interested, and I might add if you enjoy listening to academic papers, please do come by. The conference is taking place in the Audimax in the campus of the University of Luxembourg in Volferdonge. Alternatively, you could find the program and the papers on our website. Let me turn briefly to a few acknowledgments. First, I'd like to thank the Alphonse Weicker Foundation and Mr. Kiek-Schneider specifically for their generous sponsorship of tonight's lecture. We're also very grateful to ArcelorMittal, especially for hosting the event in this extraordinary building. This week's Conference on Inequality received essential support from the Luxembourg National Research Fund, FNR, and from the University of Luxembourg. All of us at LIS thank these institutions, FNR and the university, for their partnership. And finally, 2 Luxembourg ministries have been invaluable contributors to LIS for many years: the Ministry of Culture, Higher Education and Research, and the Ministry of the Economy. Their financial and collegial and intellectual support allows us to carry out our work here in Luxembourg. And we're also especially appreciative to Serge Allegrezza, the director of StatTech, who has supported LIS in countless ways for over 2 decades. This evening, we are delighted to have with us Paul Krugman. Professor Krugman received his PhD in economics from MIT. He has taught at Yale, Stanford, and MIT, and currently teaches at Princeton. He is the author or editor of over 20 books and more than 200 articles. In 1991, he was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal given by the American Economic Association to scholars under the age of 40 who have made the most important economic contributions. In 2008, he received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, honoring his work in international trade patterns. Many of us have learned a great deal from his remarkable scholarship. But the fact is that most of them know him best as the author for the last 10 years of a biweekly column in the New York Times. He is now undoubtedly the foremost economic and political commentator in the United States, and his columns also attract countless readers abroad. Every Monday and Friday, I and everyone I know open the New York Times, and before anything else, we read his column. Whatever the topic, from credit default swaps in America to war in the Middle East, from presidential malfeasance in the United States to currency policy in China, from oil leaking in the Gulf of Mexico to the fiscal crisis in Greece, his writing is always incisive and instructive. His columns are often exciting, frequently angry, always fearless, sometimes funny, and I dare say usually quite depressing. Today, I might add, was no exception. Now, in this time of economic crisis and institutional restructuring, his commentaries are more essential than ever. It's an honor to introduce him this evening. Professor Krugman, welcome to Luxembourg.
So, good evening. Let me express thanks to the Weicker Foundation, to the Luxembourg Income Study, and to ArcelorMittal for making the venue available. I just would say a word. When I was originally approached about doing this, as soon as I saw that it was from the Luxembourg Income Study, I said, okay, I'm going to do this because it's such an important part of what we know about the world. I have had a long-standing interest, both academic and very much practical, trying to understand what's happening in the question of inequality and its ups and downs, and the international perspective that comes out of LIS has been terribly important. So I eagerly accepted the invitation. Then I found myself with a bit of a quandary, because it was clear that when I spoke here, there had to be some relationship to the whole theme of income distribution inequality. And there's a bit of a problem, which is that I'm a consumer of this research, not a producer. I don't have I've never done any original work with the data series. I certainly haven't done anything related to the awesome data collection efforts, interpretation efforts, and so on that are the meat of what LIS does. And since I knew there were going to be a number of people connected with lists and with this conference, I thought, I should not be up here pretending to be what I'm not. So I have no deep thoughts about measuring inequality and only some loose speculation about sources of the trends. So what should I do? And I realized that this was an opportunity to speculate, in I hope a somewhat partially informed way, about something that has been bothering me, been on my mind for some time, which is the relationship between inequality and the current macroeconomic crisis, which is something that I think I do know something about and have done some real work. So without further ado, let me tell you what the issue that's bothering me is, and go into the discussion. So first of all, if you follow developments in the United States, if you've been looking at trying to understand historical trends, both economic and political, one of the things that is central in trying to make sense of America today, and to a lesser extent other countries, especially in the English-speaking world, is the extraordinary resurgence of inequality since about 1980. This is one long-term series we use a lot. This is from Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, who are, but it's of a form of work that Tony Atkinson, who's here, has really been very influential in disseminating. It's the use of income tax records, which go back much further than most of the formal statistical apparatus of today's nations, to try and get a really long perspective. And this is an estimate of the share of the highest income 1% of the U.S. population in total income, not including capital gains, though that doesn't change the picture very much one way or the other. And what it gives you is what's very familiar to all of us now in this U-shape. Up until, even a quarter century ago, before the magnitude of what was happening became clear, it was widely believed that it was an inevitable thing that as countries grew rich, they became basically middle class, that income inequality would surge during the early stages of industrialization, that you would have a Gilded Age, but then you would settle down towards a relatively equal, by no means flat, but a relatively equal income distribution. And then something happened, and we began to see a sharp rise in inequality. This is focusing on top share, any measure you take. It's clear that we've had a drastic increase in inequality, and in the United States, the pre-tax share of income of the top 1% and of the top 1/10%, and so on. This stuff is fractal. Look at any subset, and you find the same thing happening. So the top 1/10% has grown much richer relative to the next 9/10%, and so on. That there's been this that inequality has gone back up to levels not seen since the 1920s. Extraordinary development, much controversy about what's behind it. I'll address a little bit of that controversy in a little bit later in today's talk. Now, I would talk about this quite a lot, and in addition to economics conferences, I give a lot of talks of various kinds, especially when doing things like promoting books. So I talk a lot to audiences which are not professional economists. And here's one of the things that would happen. So whenever I would talk to a lay audience, which is not a term of disrespect, just people who are not, people who don't do economics all the time, I talk to them about inequality and the importance of these trends in inequality. And I would say, well, we've now reached levels of inequality that we haven't seen since the eve of the Great Depression. And inevitably, people in the audience would say, oh, well, in that case, we must be due for another Great Depression. And I would say, well, no, let me explain macroeconomics to you. This doesn't have to happen. It's not, what matters is that there be sufficient demand. It doesn't matter whether it's rich people buying expensive luxury goods or middle-class people buying utilitarian things. There's no real reason to think that a return to 20s levels of inequality means a return to a 30s level economic crisis. And then guess what? We had a spectacular economic crisis. This particular chart, if you do the international macroeconomics, this has become now a very important chart. It's part of work by the economic historians Barry Eichengreen and Kevin O'Rourke, who have put together data from the Great Depression and compared it with data from the current episode. They've been updating this on a regular basis. It turns out that the first year of the current crisis was every bit as bad as the Great Depression. World industrial production fell just as much as it did during the Great Depression. World trade actually fell more. Looking at measures of disruption in financial markets, the first year was actually worse, if anything, than the first year of the Great Depression. In effect, we did have a blow to the world economy that was as severe as what happened in 1929, 1930. The second year, thankfully, was not the same. We have seen a recovery in industrial production, that we've seen a turnaround in world trade. I am of the school that says that the difference between now and 80 years ago is because this time the policies weren't as bad, that we had this time around central banks did not raise interest rates in an attempt to defend their gold reserves. This time around, governments did not try to balance their budgets in the heat of the crisis. And this is what made the difference this time around. Now, give us time. There are still plenty of policy mistakes that can be made, and I'm actually a lot less optimistic about looking forward than I am about what happened then, but that's a subject for another talk. I'm concerned that we may be having a slow motion version of what happened last time. But for now, I just want to say that the shock, the financial crisis, was in fact incredibly severe. The macroeconomic crisis was incredibly severe. We did in fact have something like a 1929, 1930 experience. And that's interesting. Maybe my audiences, maybe the people who said, gee, if we're back to 20s levels of inequality, we're about to have a 30s type crisis, we're not so foolish after all. Maybe there is something to this. And so the question becomes, is there something to it, and if so, what? So it's not what you call a statistical sample. We've had two episodes, high inequality followed by severe crisis, but it's sufficiently big, sufficiently striking that you would ask why. And so I'd say that there are three possibilities. One is it just happened that after seeing what looked from an income distribution point of view like a return to the Gilded Age, that we then had something that from a macroeconomic point of view looked a whole lot like the early stages of the Great Depression. And that's certainly possible. The second, which I think is something that I actually strongly believe is true, it's at least part of the story, is that there's an element of common causation, that the changes in politics and policy that helped to feed the rapid rise in inequality also helped to recreate a vulnerable financial system, that in effect the United States, and to a lesser extent other advanced nations, turned their back on the various reforms, social, economic, and financial, that had taken place in the 1930s, and in the process both recreated highly unequal societies and also recreated dangerously unstable financial systems. And the third, which I'm agnostic, but I think there are some interesting thoughts, interesting possibilities, is that there is actually something to the notion that a highly unequal society is inherently vulnerable from a macroeconomic point of view. So, obviously, if it's one, I have nothing to say. stuff happens. But if 2 and 3 are interesting. So let me talk a little bit about the possible causation. Now, background, something that is not totally obvious from the economic numbers, but is very obvious from other sources, including quantitative evidence, is the sharp change in economic ideology and in policy that took place in the United States and the UK, and to some extent even actually elsewhere, but really dramatic in the case of the US and the UK. The sharp rightward shift. There's an interesting body of work that comes out of political science rather than economics, which is the work of Poole, Rosenthal, and McCarty, who have developed a very ingenious way of using voting data in the US Congress to map political positions, and which enables them to, among other things, ask how far apart are the parties. And aside to the academics here, I got really excited by the Poole, Rosenthal, McCarty work, and I said, yeah, this is really interesting. It was about 6 months before I realized that Rosenthal was in the next building and that actually McCarty was in my building, but wrong department, you see, so I wasn't talking to them. So anyway, but now I do talk to them. Here's now, they have updated, but I just used the quick and dirty picture. This is one of the pictures that they present in their book, Polarized America. The red line is a measure of the distance between the two major U.S. political parties on a dimension which more or less corresponds to left-right on economics. It's how far apart are the parties? By the way, you might say, well, politics is multidimensional. It's not can't be just summarized in one dimension. Actually, one of their results is yes, it can. Actually, pretty much, if you know where a member of Congress sits on the left-right spectrum on economics, you can predict how he or she will vote on almost anything, including war funding and so on. There used to be a second dimension in the United States, which was race, but that has now collapsed. So now it really is one-dimensional. And what you see is that before the Great Depression, the United States had a highly polarized political system, very, very deep philosophical, political policy differences between the parties. By the end of World War II, much diminished. Not, as we like to say now, that Dwight Eisenhower was well to the left of any major figure in today's Democratic Party. And then a sharp rise in polarization, which has continued beyond this graph, with no overlap. The leftmost Republican in both houses is to the right of the rightmost Democrat. Severe difference in positions, primarily because the Republican Party has moved to the right. And you can see that actually in the numbers. The Democratic Party has moved to the left only in the sense that the conservative Southern Democrats have now become Republicans. So the result is, and of course, although neither party has had a monopoly on office for most of the period since 1980, the Republicans have either controlled government or had an effective coalition with conservative Democrats determining policy. And of course, as you can see from the picture, there's a strong correlation with income distribution. The years of relatively equal income distribution were also the years of relatively nonpartisan politics. The years in which the income distribution were highly unequal were also years of high polarization, suggesting that there's something going on here. Which way does the causation run? Obvious question. Well, interesting question. It's interesting that Poole and Rosenthal originally just took it for granted that it was the economics driving the politics, that growing income inequality leads to greater political polarization. Others, including myself, have questioned that. For one thing, the timing appears to be wrong. If you look, the sharp rise in political polarization leads, certainly in this later period, the rise in political polarization leads the widening of income inequality. And in fact, if you do a more sort of narrative approach, what you can see is that the rightward swing of the modern Republican Party began circa 1970, whereas the real widening of income disparities seems to come somewhat later. And there are a number of factors probably going on there, and institutionally, many of the sort of institutional framework, what Hillary Clinton famously and completely accurately called the vast right-wing conspiracy, really was put in place in the early 1970s. Does that lead to increased inequality? I would argue, at least in some dimensions, it clearly does. Certainly, after tax, inequality is increased by the reduction in top tax rates. But even pre-tax, there are things like the way that unions have been treated in the legal framework. There are issues like minimum wage policy. And probably at least part of the story involves actually the financial sector. Now, one of the things that is sort of correlated in time with these political and income distribution changes is, in fact, the sheer size of the financial sector in the U.S. economy. So, this is from Thomas Philippon, who's been working on this, an estimate, cleaning up the data, of the size of the financial industry in the economy. Grew, obviously it grew dramatically as we became a sophisticated economy over the course of the early 20th century, then plunged, made a somewhat recovery after the war was over and business as usual resumed, but then began this enormous ascent after about 1980. Now, exactly what that's about, actually Philippon himself, and I should say this since I'm using his numbers, he believes that a lot of the rise in the importance of finance was what made sense, that it was the increasing complexity of the economy, and in particular the need to funnel a lot of capital into new sectors in technology required a larger finance sector. I'm not fully convinced, but actually even Philippon says that the growth of finance after about 2000, he has no idea what all those people and all that money was doing. But in any case, sharp rise in the financial sector. There's some other evidence that suggests that deregulation played a critical role. So I'll give you one more picture that's related to that, which is a picture from a study by Campbell and Herkowitz. This is measuring household debt, scaled two ways. It's household debt as a share of assets, mortgage debt as a share of the value of owner-occupied real estate. Dramatic break in that series, just about fourth quarter of 1982, which is when the Garn-St. Germain Act was passed, which was in fact an act that substantially deregulated the U.S. banking system. There were other things one would want to talk about. The Garn-St. Germain Act, among other things, set the stage for the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, which was an enormously expensive fiasco. But despite that, the trend continued. This is a way, I think, of seeing in one particular case that deregulation, and I think even more important, a change in regulatory attitudes, paved the way for a much larger financial sector. Okay, two things to say about that. One is that the change in regulatory attitudes was part and parcel of the general shift towards a belief that in getting the government out of the way, a general shift towards a more laissez-faire or neoliberal or whatever you want to call it attitude towards the economy, which was also the same attitude that led to lower tax rates on high incomes, led to lower tax rates on corporations, led to steady decline in the real value of the minimum wage, led to the government stepping aside largely from the process of union organization, making it much easier for employers to fight the creation of unions or the expansion of unions, all of which had some bearing on inequality as well. The second thing to say is that the rapid growth of the financial sector was itself a contributing factor to rising inequality, especially at the very top end. So there's been an explosion of incomes in the very, very high end of the United States, the top 100th of 1%. And there have been some efforts to figure out who are these people, who makes these extraordinarily high incomes. In the modern world, they are not primarily people who are living on property income. This was the case in the 1920s, but not so now. It is primarily some form of compensation. Who receives that kind of compensation? Well, CEOs of large corporations, Fortune 500 CEOs, yes, but they actually don't seem to be driving the increase. Sports stars, entertainment stars are a surprisingly large share of all of that. I'm going to take a quick aside. I have spoken to business people, serious business people, who believe that the shift to greater inequality in the United States was actually set in motion when the TV networks began showing football games, which is what led to the explosion of salaries for sports stars. And at that point, business executives started saying, well, I should be getting that kind of pay too. But anyway, but the largest group, as far as we can tell, is actually financial industry. It really is hedge funds, investment banking, and to some extent, ordinary banking. So that the large rise in the share, in the scale of the financial industry, and possibly also a change in the character away from the sort of stodgy traditional banking towards more complex forms of banking, helped to drive the inequality. Now, one of the papers in the conference that begins tomorrow is concerns an economy where the link between financialization and rising inequality is much more dramatic and easily documented than it is for the United States, namely Iceland. And I was really struck by that because there at least you can show very clearly that the explosion in size of the financial industry drove a sharp increase in inequality within the country. And there, of course, also you can clearly see that the explosion in size of the financial industry set the stage for severe crisis and ultimately a sort of catastrophe. Surely then, you can argue that since there was a political component driving at least some of the increase in inequality, and also perhaps that rising inequality led to the rise of of conservative or free market economic policies, which is something that sounds counterintuitive, but there is some argument on its behalf. These policies also led to deregulation of the financial sector, a sharp increase in the size of the financial sector, and a great increase in financial fragility, great increase in the vulnerability. For the United States, at least, the story, as nearly all of us tell it, is that to some extent there was what's seen here, which is a growing exposure. I'm sorry, I probably didn't say this. What's happening here is that requirements for collateral were sharply reduced. Prior to 1982, banks would demand a lot of proof that you either had the income to pay back your debt, or that the assets against which you were borrowing were sufficient. Those standards were sharply reduced thereafter. Interestingly, the same study also presents some informal evidence that that prior to the 1930s, lending standards were more like those of modern times, and it was only in the 1930s, under pressure of financial reform, that lending standards were greatly tightened. So there really is this U-shaped thing on bank exposure, just as there is on income distribution and political polarization. Beyond that, however, there was the rapid growth of non-standard banking that the expansion of institutions that created what effectively were substitutes for bank deposits that paid somewhat higher interest rates. So that there are various forms, but the most important was repo. That investment banks would borrow large sums overnight as a way to finance longer-term and often illiquid investments. And that many investors, especially businesses, would park their cash in these overnight loans, better return than leaving it in a bank deposit. This created a financial system that was doing what banks do, which is to offer people short-term assets, but use those savings to finance longer-term investments, but without any of the protections, without any of the restrictions, and without also any of the guarantees that protect conventional banking systems. Shadow banking has become the widely accepted term. Most estimates now suggest that on the eve of the crisis, about 60% of the U.S. banking system, properly understood, was actually shadow banking, not conventional banking, and Wild West, completely open, as exposed as the banking system of 1930 had been, which is why we were able to have this crisis. If the political environment had been different, regulation would have been expanded to cover this new system. People would have looked at this and said, well, this is the same, poses the same dangers, the same risk of bank runs as the old system, so we should be treating it much the same way. But in the political environment of post-Reagan America, that was not going to happen. And so the same forces, again, that led to inequality led, if you like, to a kind of tolerant attitude towards the increasing evasion of regulatory control by the banking system, and set us up for a potential crisis. Okay. As I say, I believe this story. I believe that there was, in fact, a political shift which led to changes in government policies that had, as one of their effects, a substantial widening of income inequality, and as another of their effects, a substantial deregulation or failure to update regulation in the financial system, which prepared the ground for the financial crisis. And in that sense, it is not an accident that we saw inequality rise to 1920s levels and then proceeded to have a 1929-30 type crisis. But what about a direct causal link? What about the possibility that inequality in itself leads to a more vulnerable macroeconomy? Well, there's actually a long tradition along those lines, but one that isn't much honored today. So if you go back and read old literature, or some but relatively non-mainstream modern literature, you'll see a lot of discussion of income inequality as a cause of potential crisis, most of it revolving around the idea of underconsumption. The idea originally, going back to the British economist Hobson, late 19th, early 20th century, was that we have high inequality. A lot of income is going to wealthy people. The wealthy people are not spending their income, which means that there isn't actually enough spending to keep everybody fully employed. And so we are vulnerable, and you can get by for a while through bubbles, or at the time there was a lot of discussion of imperialism as being somehow a way of trying to find the markets that you couldn't have at home because of an excessively unequal income distribution. But sooner or later, the lack of sufficient demand is going to catch up with you. And you can find people making the traditional underconsumptionist argument to this day. Here's from recent writing by Robert Reich, former labor secretary. And well, you can see, the problem wasn't that consumers lived beyond their means, it was that their means didn't keep up with what the growing economy was capable of producing. A larger and larger share of total income went to people at the top. So in the longer term, he's saying basically that we need to have a more equal income distribution in order to have a durable economic recovery, because the rich don't spend enough on consumer goods. Okay, I agree with his policy desire, but I have problems with this as a story about what went wrong, at least this time. So underconsumption, as I say there, has conceptual problems. The conceptual problem is this. While it is true that if you look at a snapshot of the economy, rich people save a share of their income, and middle-income people a much lower share, and low-income people generally dissave. That is not the same as saying that if income shifts towards the top, the overall savings rate will rise. And the reason was explained by none other than Milton Friedman, who's pointed out that the spending of a consumer, spending of a family, by and large reflects what they consider to be their normal or permanent income. And that sort of as a statistical necessity, if you look at the people who have high incomes in any given year, some of them will be people who had unusually high incomes. And if you look at the people who, and therefore won't be spending up to their income because they know it's not something they can count on. You look at the people who have low incomes, many of them will be people having unusually low incomes for themselves, and will therefore be spending based on out of their assets or based on their future income. And it's a kind of ecological fallacy. You're going to see what looks like a situation where people with high incomes have a higher savings rate, but in fact, the overall savings rate won't change much, even if you change the distribution of income quite a lot. Which was, in fact, turns out to have been the case, that over a long period of time, until about 20 years ago, savings rates, at least in the United States, were pretty stable during periods of both high and low income inequality. Empirically, the problem becomes even larger if you look at the United States, because during the same period when income inequality was soaring, a funny thing was happening to consumption. In fact, the consumption share in US GDP has been rising, the savings rate, there are conceptual difficulties with the standard use measure of personal savings, but the basic story is truly right, that we went from a normal savings rate of around 8% of personal income in the 80s to approximately 0 in recent years. So a sharp fall in savings, not a sharp rise. So in fact, you did not see anything that looked like underconsumption. There is an argument that we actually have a global problem of excessive savings. And in fact, a fellow by the name of Ben Bernanke gave a famous speech about the global savings glut. But that savings glut is not arising because rich Americans save too much. That savings glut, if it's a problem, is arising because the Chinese and the and the oil-rich countries, and although he didn't say it, the Germans are saving too much. So it's not a problem that has to do with income distribution within the advanced countries. However, so underconsumption is not going to work. The underconsumptionist story, although it has a long and distinguished intellectual lineage, just clearly doesn't help us at all here. But there's a reverse story. And it's a story that it's not exactly overconsumption, but it's a story that says that highly unequal income distribution can actually lead to excessive debt levels, can lead to, essentially at the household level, financial decisions that make the economy as a whole more fragile. Probably the most eloquent advocate of this view has been Robert Frank, who's written a number of books and articles about the hidden social costs of high income inequality. And I'll just pick up a passage that I think gets at the heart of it, which is that essentially that high spending by the well-off induces high spending beyond your means by the less well-off, by the middle class. And as Frank argues, that's not because people are stupid. It's not because people just don't understand. It's because, for a number of reasons, it's very hard to disengage yourself from the standard that's set in the rest of society. There's actually a wonderful passage, Adam Smith wrote about this. Wealth of Nations is a much more interesting book than the simple, free market's good summary would put it, about how in his time, having one good linen shirt had become essential to become even minimally respectable. And so everyone had to buy one good linen shirt, even if they couldn't afford it. In modern times, you have to have, for many purposes, a decent car, clothes of a certain kind, and perhaps most important, it's really, really important to have a house in the right location. In the United States, that's extremely acute because a house in the right location means having your children in an adequate school. And you say, well, all right, so why don't I get a house in the right location, but one that's extremely small? Well, it just doesn't work that way. Those things are not available. So people are, in fact, to some extent, forced onto a debt treadmill in order to keep up with the standards that are being set by a highly unequal society. I mentioned Warren and Tyagi. Warren is Elizabeth Warren, financial reformer, I guess we could say mother of the Consumer Protection Agency that is about to be established in the United States, and probably its first head. Liz Warren had a very interesting book done with Tyagi, which is her daughter, actually. She's a lawyer specializing in bankruptcy cases. Looked and basically did a study to ask why personal bankruptcies in the United States seem to be rising year after year, even in good times, and found that it was not, as the stereotype has it, because people max out on their credit cards trying to buy fancy TV sets. It is because people take on mortgages bigger than they can afford in an attempt to buy a house in a decent school district. And so the inequality and the inequality of education was really the biggest driving force behind these difficulties, which would suggest that there may actually be a problem of high inequality driving middle-class families to stretch themselves. Now, what evidence do we have? There is, what we have is another correlation. And it's not too easy to distinguish, may I say, from the financial regulation, deregulation story, but it's still, I think, intriguing to look at. This is, the blue line is that same inequality picture. It's the same, it's the top one share from Piketty and Sias. The red and, I guess that's green lines are two different, but not that different, measures of indebtedness. The red line is non-corporate debt, as a share of total income, which goes way back as a series. The green line is household and nonprofit debt, which is the modern series. And you can see the overlap to see that they aren't behaving very differently. Couple of things to say. If you are careless, you would look at that and say, oh, gee, wasn't there a spike in debt that led to the Great Depression? That's actually not right. That's actually post-1929. The ratio of debt to income soared, not because debt was rising, but because income was collapsing, both because of a real contraction of the economy and because of deflation. I would say you might want to think about that right now as people talk about the need for everybody to borrow less. There was a real paradox of deleveraging that took place in the 1930s as everybody tried to spend less and the economy collapsed and people's debt position became even worse. Then a dramatic drop in debt, especially during World War II, which had multiple virtues in terms of reducing debt. First, nobody could borrow because consumer credit was not available during the war. And anyway, if you did borrow, you couldn't buy anything because everything was rationed. And incomes were good because of the war hiring. And finally, there was a fair bit of inflation, which reduced the real value of debt. So a big reduction. And then a rise back to something like a normal level after the war. But then, beginning just about the time that income inequality begins its great upward march, a great upward march in household indebtedness as well. Some of that, again, may be because bank lending standards were softened, and so it became easier to borrow, but probably, I think, or at least one can argue that it's something like the Robert Frank effect, that people are borrowing because in a highly unequal society, you're trying desperately to keep up, not so much for the sake of appearances or for the sake of your vanity, but because for the sake of your children, for the sake of having a good enough car to make an impression on your potential boss, and so on down the line. That high level of household debt, arguably then, is an important part of the vulnerability that led us to crisis, in particular because a fair bit of that household debt was debt run up to purchase houses by people who either couldn't afford the house or would lose their ability to pay the mortgage as soon as anything went wrong. Nothing conclusive. Here's a quick summary of what the argument would look like. Politics. I can go on and on about the sources of the political change, and it is, I think, a fascinating question why there was such a huge shift in politics. If you're a conservative in the United States, you'll say it's because people were convinced by the persuasiveness of conservative arguments. If you're a liberal, you'll say it's because Nixon's Southern strategy won over the vote of Southern whites and changed everything. Whatever it was, clearly a sharp rightward shift in the United States and to a lesser extent in the UK and even in Canada. Politics clearly, in a number of ways, we can argue about the size of it, politics promoting inequality, and perhaps inequality itself feeding back into increased conservatism, free market tilt of the political spectrum. Politics also very clearly contributing to financial fragility. I think we can safely say that if the attitudes towards regulation in advanced countries in 2005 had been the same as the attitudes towards regulation that had prevailed in 1975, we would not have had this financial crisis. You can argue we would have had other problems, but we would not have had this crisis, and we would not have had something that so much resembled the beginnings of the Great Depression. And possibly, I think probably, but the scale is arguable, some two-way linkages between inequality and financial fragility. Inequality most likely through the debt treadmill feeding financial fragility, and the hypertrophy of the financial sector being a significant factor in rising inequality, at least at the very top end. I guess the short summary is, maybe we had this coming to us. That by retracing, in many ways, the history of economic policies, in important ways, going back to the policies that prevailed before the Great Depression, we actually did help create the conditions for what we at least hope is only a partial scale repeat. So let's hope that we actually do a pretty good job of bringing this thing under control and maybe manage to restore a little bit more equality in the income distribution while we're at it. Thank you. I'm open for questions.
I accepted to make a little bit animation and taking questions from the audience. This presentation, Professor Krugman, is quite challenging, especially for Europeans, because we are accustomed to be, let's say, quite critical about the political economy of our societies. But this is a very different view. We were expecting something about deregulation and about G20. Everybody has understood that the crisis has something to do with subprimes and toxic products which have been bought by bankers. And here we have a very different view of what happened, at least in the US. And I want just to add one information. I was looking at your graphs and I saw that you were showing that the financial industry in the US have increased tremendously.
Right.
In Luxembourg, we have a financial industry. It's about 25% of GDP, and even more if you take all the activities around it. But the interesting thing is that the inequality in Luxembourg stayed very low in comparison with other countries, especially, of course, UK, US, but compared to other countries of the European Union. And so institutions and redistributions matter a lot.
Right.
So this is my first question, and then I give the mic to the audience. What about the institutional setting compared the US with Europe?
Okay. I actually have a view on this, which is, or I have an observation. And it doesn't fit in too well with the theme of my talk, actually, but I'll make it anyway. Because although I didn't emphasize this, the inequality trends have been quite different. You basically have a club of Anglo-Saxon countries which had dramatic increases in inequality, and then much less in the continental Europe, much less in Japan. Some, I shouldn't even talk about this, given that all the list people here who know better than I do. But so there is a distinct difference in the inequality trends. Despite that, and despite the very large differences in institutions, what is striking, so just step away from the inequality issues and talk about finance and macroeconomics, what is striking is the extent to which the United States and Western Europe managed to have quite similar crises, quite similar messes, with different form. So in the United States, the commercial banks, conventional banking, was relatively, while it certainly overextended itself, was less central to the crisis, and the exotic shadow banking was central. In Europe, you had massive overextension of conventional banking, so that we had very high leverage shadow banks in the United States going wild. In Europe, you had conventional banks leveraging themselves up and going wild. We had runaway housing boom in coastal Florida and Southern California and Nevada. You had runaway housing boom in coastal Spain and the UK and Ireland, and the dimensions of the crisis are remarkably similar on both sides. The decline in GDP, similar on both sides of the Atlantic. So it was really quite interesting to see how, through different institutional frameworks, you managed to basically achieve the same disastrous result. Something to think about.
So, questions, please, comments? You have a mic?
Thank you. Armand Kliss. I have two questions of a more general character and non-polemical, non-ideological character. The first refers to your first slide, the aftermath, the effects of the crisis of 1929 and 2008. First 12 months, the similarity, and then all of a sudden strong divergence. So my question is, what is the impact, in your view, of Asia, above all China, India, also other Asian countries, not Japan, of course, in this, which had still strong rates of growth in those years after 2008, and then also for looking into the future, how do you evaluate this role, positively or negatively, in the future? The second question, also very general, is about correlation between inequality on the one hand and macroeconomic difficulties, vulnerability, crisis on the other hand, or to put it positively, between inequality and economic success. There are different models, Scandinavian model on the one hand, and Anglo-Saxon on the other hand. But
I presume the question is, do we need inequality?
No, the question is then, on this debate, in a sense, the jury is still out, yes? And my question to you is the jury, that means all these various economists like yourself, is it bound to stay out forever on this very fundamental question of all economists since Adam Smith have been asked, and even before Adam Smith have been asking themselves? Sorry for having been a bit long.
Okay, so on the first point, I don't have right in my head the shares of that industrial production index, what share is emerging Asia. It's significant, but not still a long way from being dominant. So most of that story, here, this is the chart we're talking about. Most of that, of the rise that you see there is actually taking place in the OECD countries. It's not primarily that China is growing while the rest of us are stagnating. Industrial production has gone up quite a lot since the trough in Europe and in the US. It's not really, I don't think the Asian story is making a huge difference to that number in a direct sense. The fact that demand did not collapse in emerging nations is helpful. The fact that some of them have clung to policies that produce persistent trade surpluses is less helpful. But it's not, I think, really central to this story. And it's worth remembering that when we're thinking about world economic developments, macroeconomic developments, what matters is not income at purchasing power parity, which is what one often uses for comparisons, but actual purchasing power at current exchange rates, market values. And by that standard, even now, China is about the size of Japan. It's not a huge player in the world economy yet, not a dominant player. So it doesn't really make that difference. So I think the story is really not. This is a story. The reason that the story has played out differently so far from the 1930s is different monetary policy, different fiscal policy, and very crucially, I think, simply the fact that governments are so much larger than they were then, that the existence of large social insurance programs, which cushioned the blow of the recession, was an important stabilizer in the current crisis. So that I think is the story. About inequality, boy, there is a huge, highly contentious literature on the relationship between inequality and economic success. The remarkable thing, I think, is the extent to which people in the United States tend to accept it as axiomatic that you have to have something like our current level of inequality in order to have the incentives to grow and produce. And it often seems to me that that there's been almost a deliberate effort to forget, in the case of the United States, about the 45 or so years when we had a relatively equal income distribution, or to rewrite it. I'm constantly hearing assertions that, well, the U.S. economy had very poor growth until Reagan cut top marginal tax rates, and saying, post-war generation, my parents, your parents, they all turned middle class then. How did that get eliminated from your memory of history? It is interesting to see that there have been highly successful European economies with quite equal income distributions. It's now, even a U.S. liberal like myself will say that, okay, I really don't think we want to go back to the 91% top marginal tax rate of the 1950s, which nobody paid. We'll say that we don't. There's a level of excess there, but I think what the evidence basically suggests is that you're capable of having a successful economy with very different income distributions, and you're actually also capable of having an unsuccessful economy with very different income distributions.
Other questions? Yeah. The rector of the university.
Well, you have shown us a series of data correlations, and then you have asked us a certain number of questions about causation. Now, I mean, you're dealing with complex problems, and it would be very surprising that there are only 2 or 3 relevant magnitudes to deal with them. We know from the harder sciences that when a problem has 20 or 30 magnitudes and you integrate out most of them and you leave at the end 2 or 3, that you still see correlations, but the causation then becomes a very tough issue. And usually the question of asking, what is the cause and what is the effect, the entanglement is so large that does not make sense anymore. What happens in your field?
Let me say, though, that on many of these, many social, political, and economic issues, in a way, the surprising thing is the relative simplicity of the picture. That is, for certainly looking at U.S. history, you might be tempted to say, I think I said this, but let me say it more clearly, you might be tempted to say that, look, the political process is complex, there are many issues that all matter to people, surely voting in the U.S. Congress must be a multidimensional affair. But it is not. In fact, if you take somebody's denominate index, which is the score on a left-right spectrum inferred from their voting on a number of bills, which clearly corresponds to left-right on the political spectrum, I can tell you with high accuracy which way that member of Congress voted on funding for the Iraq War. I can tell you pretty much where that member of Congress stands on immigration issues, things that should not be obviously related, but clearly are. So that's a surprising simplicity. And if you look at the broad sweep of events in the United States, you might think that the trends in inequality, the trends in political polarization, the trends in household debt would all be complex and have nothing much to do with each other. But in fact, they all follow more or less the same pattern with more or less the same timing, which is a clear indication that something causal is going on. Now, what it is much less clear. So you're not going to be able to settle that issue simply by looking at the correlation. And I think we have, to some extent, we look at what we know about the way economies work, what we know about the political process to try and narrow it down. But this is speculative. I'm giving myself the luxury of saying, well, here's something interesting, here's some stories about how it might be happening. But you really want to think that for the US at least, there is this swoosh, sort of a Nike swoosh in our history that is present in many, many aspects of our society. And the question why that happened is, it certainly did happen, and the questions about why are something we can discuss.
Other questions?
Good evening. I'm your layman in the public. I have a very short question. If you look at the last slide, which I managed to grasp.
Yeah, I can probably get there.
You're mentioning that for the fragility to go from inequality to fragility, you need actually debt to increase quite substantially, and you've mentioned that a couple of times in your presentation. Now, if you look at the politics, would it be simplistic then to say that actually it boils down to deregulation of the financial sector that causes the crisis, or is it going much wider? Had you other factors in mind?
Yeah, I would say that deregulation and failure to update regulation is at the core of it. That I'll add a caveat to that in a moment, but fundamentally, yes. We created we allowed a financial system to grow up, partly by removing regulations, but at least in the United States, equally importantly, by failing to update regulations to the changing nature of the system in a way that created both a highly fragile financial system with high leverage and widespread risk-taking that was not fully understood, and also a highly leveraged household sector, which was highly vulnerable then when the crisis struck. So I think that is the core of the story. And I guess at a basic level, I would say that it's very much about leverage. Now, there is an argument that says that you need to look at international imbalances and capital flows that made cheap money available, and it was going to find an outlet someplace, regardless. And I'm of mixed mind about how far I take that. But yeah, I think it is basically, it is the failure to regulate a financial system. That this, at some level, some people in this room will know what I'm talking about, I hope, but at some level, this is all Diamond Dybvig. When the famous paper on the theory of bank runs, at a fundamental level, what we're seeing is a standard bank run on a mammoth scale, and it's possible because we failed to regulate the banks, but even more important, because we failed to understand that a bank is not defined by what it looks like. We still, in the United States at least, had reasonably good regulation of big marble buildings with rows of tellers. But there are lots of things that are functionally banks that don't look like that, and those were not regulated at all.
There was a question. Mr. Thomas, member of the European Parliament. Mike, please. There is one here, behind you.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is, some academics mentioned that part of the starting of the crisis in US was also linked to the rising gasoline and prices, and that those people who were highly indebted were not able to pay them back. So is this something which played a role or not at all? And second is on this discussion on do we need to continue to do state-paid recovery programs versus cutting down very severely on our debt. Where do you stand, and how do you see that discussion?
I thought the whole world knows where I stand on the second one. So I think you know, I believe that the sudden turn towards austerity is that was the slightly cryptic remark I said about in the first year not repeating the policy mistakes of the Great Depression, but give it time. So I think we're in the process, I believe, of replaying the mistakes that the United States made in 1937 when it cut back on stimulus too early and plunged us into a second severe recession, or the policies of Japan in 1997, which cut back on its stimulus programs prematurely and created and really plunged them into the deflationary trap that they're still in. So that's the answer on the second. On the first, I actually don't think that the gas price issue, clearly it was a hardship, particularly in the United States where people make long commutes and where some of them, a disproportionate number of the marginal home buyers were in fact people who were also making long commutes. That certainly must have increased the problems, but if you actually look at what triggered the housing bust, it was the fact that it was fundamentally unsustainable in the first place. It was a bubble. Default rates on home mortgages were low, not because people could afford the mortgages, but because in an environment of ever-rising house prices, they could always either refinance or sell the house to someone else and pay off the mortgage. And the moment that stopped, the moment that house prices stopped rising rapidly, there was bound to be an epidemic of default. There's actually a fair bit of empirical research, especially from Federal Reserve of Boston, that says that it's the rate of change of house prices that determines the rate of mortgage defaults, and almost all the other things you think should be important are not. So this was bound to happen. And I would point out also the universality of the problem, that we had more or less simultaneous and equivalently severe housing busts in, as I said, in Florida, California, Nevada, but also in Ireland and the UK and Spain. And all of them were, people were borrowing to make purchases that seemed feasible only because of the expectation of ever-rising real estate prices. And one day, Robert Shiller at Yale says that a bubble is essentially it's a natural Ponzi scheme. It doesn't require that there be anybody scheming, but nonetheless it has the same effect as a scheme in which you take the money from the next set of suckers to pay off the first set of investors and so on, and eventually you run out of suckers, and that's what happened to all of us.
Other questions? Yes, Mr. Wirth.
Maybe I have a question. You just started your talk about the situation in Iceland, and you were saying that there was the financial activities of the financial sector was simply too important. And I think question which is relevant maybe for the US, for the UK, but also for Luxembourg is it, do you think that the financial sector has become too important in the modern Western world? That is the first question. And then the second question I have, which might be linked, crisis, isn't it also simply due to a lack of competitivity?
Okay. Let me do that backwards. I assume that by competitiveness you mean national competitiveness. But the problem is, since this is a global crisis, we can't all be uncompetitive. Right? And yet, so I don't think this is an issue really of competitiveness, although for individual nations and regions, problems of competitiveness can be very large. The reason that the crisis is so intractable now in much of the European periphery is that, among other things, that during the good years, prices and wages rose rapidly, and now certainly for members of the euro. They must come down, and yet it's very hard to deal with debt problems while you're also suffering deflation. So this is, so that I think that, but that's not a general problem of competitiveness. It is a problem that is particularly specific to the eurozone. The financial sector. Okay. I'm certainly of the school that believes that that the financial sector grew too large. Now most of what I can say is based on the US experience. So I can't speak too well to the European situation. And I have no comment whatsoever on the Luxembourg financial industry, of which I know nothing. And if I had had the chance to know something, I still wouldn't have done it, because I think that's not what I should be doing here. But what do we know about the US financial sector? We had a dramatic rise, doubling of the share of GDP for financial industry as a whole. What's even more striking, actually, is if you look at a fair bit of that is ordinary branch banking and so on, retail banking, which didn't change very much. What exploded were things like securities. And securities industry, actually, it's a six-fold increase in the share of GDP. What was all of this activity doing? Well, what we were told 3 years ago was that the financial industry was doing several really important things. It was allocating capital to its most productive uses, and so you needed highly sophisticated, highly paid people to do that. And it was distributing risk by creating innovative financial instruments, which enabled the risk, particularly the risk undertaken by lenders, to be diffused among a broader segment of the population. And the defenders of what was happening, notably Alan Greenspan, were fond of making assertions to the effect that we had created a much more robust financial system. We had actually greatly reduced financial fragility through the process of creating these more complex financial instruments and through the sophistication. And so the extremely high incomes of Wall Street and the City of London and their increased share of GDP was justified by these productive things they were doing. When the crisis struck, it turned out that the allocation of capital to most productive uses consisted of channeling funds into real estate developments that have, many of which are actually vacant now, because there was no way that they would actually pay for themselves. And it really was. The investment boom, both sides of the Atlantic, was heavily real estate, primarily residential, but also commercial, and with roughly comparable disasters in both levels. The risk diffusion turns out to have been an illusion. There's actually been quite a lot of work by some of the people at the Benheim Center for Finance at Princeton on this. It turns out that by and large, these financial instruments, the most risky segment, so that on a collateralized debt obligation, the riskiest segment of the CDO would almost invariably be held by the institution creating it. So you would take a group of mortgages, bundle them, hive off stuff that was supposed to be AAA rated, although it was AAA rated, was supposed to be safe, turned out not to be safe, but the parts that weren't, which were extremely risky, were actually were held by the original institutions. And so the actual effect was not to diffuse risk, but to concentrate it in the hands of highly leveraged financial institutions, who were exactly the people you were supposed to be protecting. And so it actually increased the vulnerability of the financial system. So it's very hard to see where the productivity in all of this was. There's a game that's now played among economists. Since we had all of this financial innovation, and the game is name a financial innovation of recent decades that was unambiguously a good thing. And ATMs Cash machines are not allowed. So name another financial innovation that was clearly a good thing, and by and large, no one can come up with an answer. So this is now. You should say, well, all that's left is faith. Well, people were paying for this. It must have therefore been worth something. But there really is no real evidence that it was. And is a very long answer to a rather short question. The financial systems that have done best in this crisis are the ones that did not get very elaborate and did not actually expand as a share of GDP. So the great role model in this crisis is Canada. And the striking thing about the Canadian banking system was that it stayed boring. During all the years when great fortunes were being made south of the border, nothing much happened in Canada, and that turns out to have been a good thing.
Thank you. I think that was the last questions.
There is one more person who seems to, let's
yes,
if we can do this just for a minute.
But it's very the last question.
I'll give a short answer.
So thank you for the last question. I was attending on Friday and Saturday of last week in Brussels, the 9th meeting of people experiencing poverty in Europe. And we were talking with the delegations about politics and inequality. And the delegations, so people experiencing poverty in Europe, asked me a simple question. Why do so many or some governments think that the way out of the crisis might be by cutting our means to consume? I wasn't able to give them a very short and understandable and clear answer. I told them that I was coming to your lecture today, and they asked me to ask you the question. What would you answer? Thank you.
Very short answer.
Yes. I spent most of last week I actually spent most of the last 2 weeks in Germany, and some of it was spent in meetings with German officials, and I came away with the definite impression that it really is it's about some notion of morality. It was remarkable. Last weekend I was at a meeting in which Wolfgang Schäuble spoke, and he was impassioned, no question about the sincerity, and but it was fundamentally a moral issue. We must live within our means, and I think that's the answer. I have not. What can I say? If you ask, is there a macroeconomic model that someone could present at a seminar in the university that would explain the passionate devotion of many people in Europe to fiscal austerity right now, I don't believe there is. It's a mixture of judgments about what they think the market wants, although there's actually remarkably little sign that the market actually does want that, but they think the market will want it, and it's just a view that it is immoral to be running deficits. And I can't say that any of the discussions I've had in Germany were particularly productive.
Thank you. Discussing about morality will take us too long. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Viker Foundation. Thank you very much to ArcelorMittal. As Janet Gornick told us, the director of the Luxembourg Income Studies, there are some places left for the academic session tomorrow. So we have students, we have the staff. You can subscribe if you want. We say, of course, thank you to Paul Krugman for this very interesting and challenging thoughts. And now I think it's time for the reception. For the drink.